Hello, I'm Justine Brown. Welcome back to my bookshelf. Today we're discussing Plymouth Plantation. New England got its name from Captain John Smith when, in 1614, he mapped and claimed the vast territory for Elizabeth I. Captain Smith seems to have labeled the northern parts of Virginia New England offhandedly, as a way of planting a flag. The Puritans who would settle the area embraced the name, but in a different spirit. For them, New England was more than a colony in North America. It corresponded to an anticipated realm in the minds of these zealous English Calvinists who keenly desired to make their native land anew, to reforge it along Puritan lines. The name New England was a beacon to them. It evoked a showcase. There was an apocalyptic dimension to the concept. Many Puritans believed that Providence had tasked the New English with realizing the New Jerusalem described in Revelation. Again, as G.K. Chesterton wrote, quote, "It is something of a verbal symbol that these men founded New England in America, for indeed they tried to found it here." New England applied to the Puritan project at home and abroad. The Puritans, or godly men, as they preferred to be called, understood themselves as a people apart from other Englishmen. This belief is evident, for example, in words penned by the regicide William Gough in 1660. Dismayed by the restoration of the Stuart monarchy, Gough noted in his journal that, quote, "There was great joy among the people, but God's people lamented the profaneness with which that great joy was expressed," unquote. This distinction between the English population at large and the godly subset, God's people, is characteristic. William Gough ran for his life to Massachusetts, confident of a warm reception despite having had a price on his head due to his role in the judicial murder of the king's father, Charles I, in 1649. Charles II's amnesty excluded those 59 who had signed his father's death warrant. New Englanders treated Gough and two other regicides who fled there like heroes. So for the Stuart kings, colonies cut both ways. Yes, they siphoned off dissidents, but they could, over time, cultivate dangerous opposition. From its first settlement in 1620, the Mayflower Pilgrims of the Plymouth Plantation, New England functioned as an incubator for the godly republicanism implemented in the Old Country under Oliver Cromwell. Puritans, those Protestant revolutionaries who sought to scour vestigial Catholicism out of the Anglican Church, were political from the outset. They increasingly saw it as their mission to oppose earthly kings like James I and VI, and then his son, Charles I, contrasting them rhetorically with King Jesus. Unsurprisingly, the authorities pricked up their ears at this. For some Puritans, the reign of Christ simply meant government in strict accordance with Calvinist doctrine. Others, such as the Fifth Monarchy men, expected the literal Second Coming to occur in England in 1666, followed by the millennium, 1,000 years of divine rule on earth. Some of these congregations operated within the Anglican Church. Others broke away in order to govern themselves, which was illegal in England. The Separatists who founded Plymouth Plantation in 1620 were one such sect. We saw in an earlier video that they initially followed a dissident preacher called Robert Brown from Nottinghamshire to Leyden in the Netherlands, where such splinter groups were accepted. but they found it hard to make a living in Leyden. After a few years there, many among them began to worry that the congregation was losing its English character. Their children were finding worldly distractions in the Netherlands and looked set to marry among the Dutch, with strict Protestants to be sure, but not English. And so, paradoxically, it was partly in order to remain English that the group we know as the Pilgrims braved the rigorous Atlantic crossing aboard the Mayflower to settle in the American wilds. There, they believed they could found their ideal England, an England of saints, according to the Calvinist understanding of that word. The fact that the Pilgrims faced great hardship did not dismay them, for they had cast themselves as God's new Israelites. This was their 40 years in the desert. Their second governor, William Bradford, documented the struggles of Plymouth Plantation, a manuscript which was read attentively by successive generations of sympathetic elites back home. King James hesitated to award his political enemies a colonial charter, but at length the project went ahead with considerable help from the Merchant Adventurers Company. These men provided the ship as well as much-needed practical support, including indentured servants and supplies. The Pilgrims referred to these others as the strangers. The Pilgrims numbered 102, the strangers about 28. Among them was one Stephen Hopkins, a seasoned mariner who had taken part in the first effort to settle Bermuda, an episode that likely inspired Shakespeare's Tempest. The merchant adventurers did not share the Pilgrims' separatist vision. They expected a return on investment over the next 7 years through agriculture, fishing, and especially the fur trade. 2 grueling months at sea followed. A child was born aboard and named Oceanus. Overall, the cramped and dirty conditions did not bring the Pilgrims much closer to the strangers. Many strangers were ready to wring the Pilgrims' zealous necks. It was in fact concern over this tension that gave rise to the Mayflower Compact, a roughed-out constitution informed by biblical and common law. The Mayflower Compact's simple framing of self-government was foundational to the American project. The signers would be bound into a, quote, civil body politic, unquote, in order to pass, quote, just and equal laws, unquote, for the common good. John Locke references the compact in his Letters Concerning Toleration. Historians like David Hackett Fisher have counterbalanced this view by emphasizing the planters' deeply English culture. Faced with division, in any case, the men aboard drew up and signed the compact before touching dry land in hopes that the colony would be as governable as a traditional English village. Miles Standish was made military commander in Plymouth, a place name the Pilgrims retained in honor of the last English town they had seen. This new Plymouth was a far cry from the old. Before the weary passengers lay dunes, then unrelenting forest. William Bradford records that the newcomers were seized by panic. Quote, "But what else could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men," unquote. The ocean at their backs was now a barrier, quote, "against all the civil parts in the world," unquote. An exploratory party came across a mound which proved to be an Indian burial ground. As it turned out, the local Wampanoag tribe had been devastated by disease the year before. Discovering a cache of seed corn, they pocketed it. It was November in Massachusetts, bitingly cold and getting colder. Supplies were dwindling, At least there was a freshwater brook to be fished. The first structure they erected was a wattle and daub common house where the planters could assemble. Most continued to sleep aboard the Mayflower until more could be built. The next 4 freezing months brought disaster, a starving time to rival Jamestown. Bradford wrote, quote, "Being the depth of winter and wanting houses and other comforts, being infected with the scurvy and other diseases which this long voyage and their inaccommodate condition had brought upon them, so there died sometimes 2 or 3 of a day in the foresaid time. That of 100 and odd persons, scarce 50 remained," unquote. Only 5 out of 18 women survived. Bradford's own wife, Dorothy, drowned in a possible suicide. Springtime came at last. It brought an unexpected visitor, Samoset, an Algonquian tribesman, who strode into the camp and astonished the settlers by greeting them in their own language. "Welcome, Englishmen." It transpired that he had picked up some English from visiting fishermen. Samoset stayed the night. The planters, having presented him with gifts of a knife and jewelry, he returned bearing venison and hides. With valuable advice from Samoset, his friend Squanto, and members of the Wampanoag people, the Plymouth settlers raised their first crops. In addition to oats, turnips, carrots, peas, wheat, and barley from home, they learned to farm squash, pumpkins, maize, and beans. In autumn 1621, the Pilgrims invited the tribesmen who had helped them to attend an English-style harvest festival. It has, of course, gone down in history as the first Thanksgiving. Famously, the Pilgrims tried agricultural communism at first. Their reasons for doing so are in dispute. Revolutionary Protestants saw themselves as restoring early Christianity. Bradford wrote that the churches should, quote, "revert to their ancient purity and recover their primitive order, liberty, and beauty," unquote. The following passage from the Acts of the Apostles played a part. Quote, "And all that believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all men, as every man had need," unquote. Moreover, the merchant adventurers had specified that every member should farm common land, apparently believing that this was the best way to recoup their investment. The Pilgrims' first version of fair distribution was a disaster. All the land was held in common, and everyone was expected to work it. The results were terrible. Certain people consistently toiled hard, while others consistently slacked off, complaining of various ailments. The system meant that malingerers ate either way. The hard workers resented being unequally yoked, sweating, as they saw it, for the benefit of other families. The arrangement corroded the community fabric. Very little food was being produced, and starvation loomed again. Citing St. Paul, as Captain John Smith had done in Jamestown, quote, "If a man will not work, neither let him eat," unquote, Bradford essayed a new, more distributist interpretation of the Acts of the Apostles. He allocated each householder a plot of land to farm. More women arrived on the Anne. At long last, fortune smiled on Plymouth Plantation. The modest success of the Plymouth experiment, together with Archbishop William Laud's crackdown on Puritans, spurred a huge new influx known as the Great Migration. The years that Charles I ruled without Parliament, 1629 to 1640, were quite peaceful and prosperous, but Puritans deemed Charles's personal rule a tyranny by definition. 80,000 of them poured out of England, bound for America, Ireland, Barbados, and the Dutch Republic. Puritans who established the Massachusetts Bay Colony were determined to showcase an ideal England governed by saints, believing that God had made a covenant with them for that purpose. These new colonists were an elite group animated by a deep sense of conviction. In his sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, their leader, John Winthrop, famously envisioned the colony as a, quote, city on a hill with the eyes of the people all upon them, unquote. He arrived aboard the Arbella in 1630. Another passenger was the poetess Anne Bradstreet. In her poem, Dialogue Between Old England and New, Bradstreet depicts the mother country as mired in immorality. Quote, Old England lists her sins, breach of sacred laws, idolatry, supplanter of a nation, with foolish, superstitious adoration, are liked and countenanced by men of might. The gospel is trod down and hath no right, unquote. The new colony quickly outshone neighboring Plymouth and was hugely inspirational for Puritans at home. It was not until 1640 that this migration pattern suddenly went into reverse, for the balance of power had shifted in the old country. Charles I had been obliged to convene Parliament, and radical MPs were streaming into position. Armed with knowledge and militants from their colonies, the saints were poised to discover New England in their own back garden. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do subscribe if you haven't already. I look forward to your comments below.